There are only three things you need to worry about when shooting in manual mode. Once you know what they are, your photography will improve in leaps and bounds. In this video, I'll demystify manual mode, explain the exposure triangle, and give you 5 good reasons why you should master manual mode. As a photography tutor, I see many people that are dubious, lacking confidence, or downright nervous of moving that camera dial to manual. So if that's you, you're not alone. Some photographers like to think of it as some kind of dark art, which I'm sure puts people off. Honestly, it's no big deal, as I'll show you. If you're new to photography or haven't yet tried manual mode, I would encourage you to give it a try. Yes, there's a bit of a learning curve, but with practice you'll master it, and the benefits are well worth the effort. I'm not dismissing auto modes, they definitely have their place, and most of the time will produce good results. Not great, but on the whole pretty good. Also, the semi-automatic modes, aperture priority and shutter priority, are definitely a good choice in some situations. Let me know in the comments if you'd like a video on semi-automatic modes. And if you stick with me until the end, I'll share some information that may just give you a light bulb moment. But what if you want to create work like this? You need to get off auto, and it might be easier than you think. So let's take a look. First of all, what is manual mode? Manual mode is simply one of the many options you have for your camera settings. These settings range from full auto, through scene modes, semi-automatic and fully manual. Only manual mode allows you full access and control over shutter speed, aperture and ISO. Notice I only mentioned 3 settings there: shutter speed, aperture and ISO, or ISO if you prefer. Neither is right and both are wrong. Anyway, there's a bit of a clue there. We only have to remember those 3 things when we think about the exposure triangle. Shutter speed means how long the shutter is open for light to come into the lens and onto the sensor. Shutter speeds are typically between 1/8000th of a second and 30 seconds. The shutter speed is shown here, and as you can see, as I alter it, this value changes. It's currently at 60, which means my shutter speed is 1/60th of a second, which we'd expect to be written like this. Some cameras do show it as 1/60th, which might be a bit confusing, but once you know what you're looking for on your camera, it's easy enough. If I continue to make the shutter speed faster and faster, the number gets higher and higher: 1/80th of a second, 100th of a second, 125th of a second, and so on. On this camera anyway, we reach 1/8000th of a second, which is fast enough to freeze a hummingbird's wings in flight. If I go the other way now, you see as I keep the shutter open for longer to let in more and more light, that number gets lower and lower all the way down to 1/4 of a second. By the way, I would recommend that 1/60th of a second is the slowest shutter speed you should use when hand holding your camera. You should ideally be using a tripod for anything slower than that. Then you'll notice that below 1/4 of a second it changes. This means 0.3 of a second, 0.4 of a second, 0.5 of a second or half a second, until we get to 1 full second of exposure time, and slower all the way down to 30 seconds. We can even set our camera to bulb mode and keep the shutter open for as long as we'd like. Hours and hours in some cases, such as for astrophotography. But that's for another video. Now, let's talk about aperture. Aperture means how large or how small the window in your lens is, which can be altered, and is measured in f-stops. Confusingly, and all down to math, the larger the f number, the smaller the aperture, and the smaller the f number, the larger the aperture. I'll be putting out more videos in the near future dedicated to aperture and depth of field, so why not click that bell icon to get notified. And the third thing I mentioned in this exposure triangle was ISO, which basically refers to how sensitive the camera sensor is to capturing light. A low number like 100 ISO being less sensitive, and higher numbers like 3200 and higher being more sensitive. The maximum ISO available will depend on which camera you have, and later I'll tell you what the acronym ISO stands for. Can you guess? It's these 3 elements combined, shutter speed, aperture and ISO, that make up the exposure triangle. A correct exposure occurs when these 3 elements are in balance. And in manual mode, you have total control over each of these settings, which allows us to have the freedom to make our own decisions and take our pictures as we want them. Exposure triangle. I'm not a massive fan of that expression. It sounds like somewhere that photographers get lost, and in some cases it is. Perhaps we should call it the exposure equation, or maybe not. That sounds like math. Anyway, as I promised you, we only need to worry about 3 things being in balance to achieve a correct or a good exposure: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Let me show you how we do that. So as you can see, I can alter the 3 settings. And when the light meter here is pointing at 0, I have achieved a correct exposure. Okay, that's most of the techie stuff out of the way. Now what's in it for you as a photographer? Well, in my opinion, there's 5 main reasons why you should use manual mode. You get total creative control over the images you want to create, such as creating bokeh, motion blur, and light painting, to name a few. Secondly, when shooting in manual, you can pretty much deal with any lighting situation. Some lighting conditions are too difficult for auto mode to deal with, a backlit subject for example. In manual mode, if the light behind your subject is far brighter than the light falling onto your subject, you can simply expose for the shadows. In other words, dial in a correct exposure for your subject and ignore the background. In portraits, this often leads to a lovely halo of backlight behind your subject. When shooting in manual mode, unlike auto, your settings won't change in between shots, unless of course you decide to change them. This means that if you're producing a gallery of images, you'll get far more professional results, and getting it right in camera saves a lot of time editing. Another typical example of needing to get a consistent exposure is when you're creating a panoramic view from a series of images. Let's say you're taking 5 images to merge into one panorama. You would typically take the exposure reading from the middle photo and keep it the same for all 5, therefore creating a consistent exposure across the whole panoramic image. In other modes, you may well find inconsistencies from shot to shot. Because you are the one changing the settings and not the camera, you can easily tweak and play with the exposure settings to your heart's content. There is no such thing as a perfect exposure. Of course, there is a range where the exposure is acceptable, but we photographers all have different tastes and influences. Manual mode allows us to explore our preferences, if that makes sense. Manual exposure is the best bet for shooting high contrast scenes, such as a bride in a white dress stood next to a groom in a dark suit on a bright sunny day. The contrast range in such an image is likely to be outside the range of other modes. Manual mode allows you to fine-tune, to correct any underexposure, being too dark, or overexposure, too bright. So hopefully I've convinced you to have a go at using manual mode. It may take some time, but with practice and a little perseverance, I'm sure you'll get the hang of it. I'd love to know in the comments if you're going to switch to manual mode. And also, let me know how you get on. Oh, and how about that light bulb moment I promised you? Remember this? The thing is this. It's the camera's metering system that indicates the correct exposure. The shooting mode determines how that exposure information is going to be applied by the camera settings. That is the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And it's important to understand that your camera has shooting modes and it has metering modes. They do very different jobs. In other words, the metering system provides information for us to be able to choose the settings we want to use. And you as a human being shooting in manual mode can decide whether you actually want to accept the exposure settings recommended by the camera's light meter or not. Or whether you want to override them and dial in your own artistic choices for whatever image you aim to produce. We are simply allowing this amazing technology to be our humble assistant. And I don't know about you, but I think that's exactly how it should be. Something else to bear in mind is that the exposure settings suggested by the camera will depend on the metering mode being used. Nothing in photography is set in stone. There's no absolute for any or all situations, and that includes which shooting mode you should be using. What to use when comes with practice and dedication. As with anything else, the more you practice, the better you'll get, and the more you'll be able to impose your personal preferences on your images. Another bonus for you, if you'd like to grab your copy of my ebook, The 3 Essential Pillars of Good Photography, you can get the download link by signing up to my newsletter. There's a link for you in the description below. I've had some great feedback, and like others, I'm sure you'd find it useful. It's completely free, so why not grab your copy? Oh, and did you guess what ISO or ISO stands for? It's simply the International Standards Organization, not even a photography term as such. It basically means that the sensitivity of a camera sensor is the same whether you own a Canon, Nikon, Sony, or any other brand. So that's today's piece of useless information then. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything, it's very much appreciated, and it definitely helps others like you find my channel. That's it for now. Maybe watch this one next. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.